It was the 30th of January 1945, and by now at the latest every German knew that the Second World War could no longer be won. While most people had cheered for the sensational successes of the Wehrmacht just a few years ago, there was no longer any enthusiasm left. At this point, the German army could no longer offer any serious resistance. The Luftwaffe was in ruins, and the navy could definitely not turn the tide. France and Belgium had been almost completely liberated, and the Allies would soon advance to the Rhine. Cities such as Hamburg, Berlin and Hanover lay in ruins. In the east, the Red Army had conquered Poland, occupied most of East Prussia, and encircled Königsberg. Millions of German refugees desperately tried to escape the retaliation of the Red Army and make their way westwards. On this very day, thousands attempted to cross the Baltic Sea on the Wilhelm Gustloff, a ship evacuating civilians and wounded soldiers. It was torpedoed and sunk by a Soviet submarine shortly afterward. 30th of January, the day the National Socialists had seized power, was usually a special occasion, but nobody had any reason to celebrate today. The situation was frankly hopeless, and there was no end to the war in sight. The German master race couldn't assert itself, and National Socialism had failed as an ideology. As always, Adolf Hitler gave a speech on the radio that day, but there was no sign of his former vigour and charisma. The self-proclaimed Führer was only a shadow of his former self, a drooling and trembling lunatic who had not appeared in public for a long time. He no longer had much to say. He had nothing more to offer than a tirade about the conspiracy plans of world Jewry to destroy Europe and an appeal to not lose faith in the final victory. After this pathetic and disheartening speech, a movie was premiered in 2 yet undamaged cinemas in Berlin and at the besieged U-boat base at La Rochelle, a historical drama called Kolberg. It retold the story of the defense of Kolberg, a town along the Prussian Baltic coast against the Napoleonic army in 1807. In many ways, the movie can be considered the greatest propaganda movie that the Third Reich ever produced. It was directed by the famous Veit Harlan, and it starred some of the most prominent German actors of that time, most notably Heinrich George. The film cost a whopping 8.8 million Reichsmark, about 6 times more than the average, which made it the most expensive feature film ever created by the Nazis. The director claimed that 187,000 extras were hired for the movie, and the battle scenes shown were hard to beat in terms of bombast. It was also a big technical achievement, and it was the 9th film ever to be released in colour in Germany. The message of Kolberg was very obvious. It wanted to symbolise the resistance against a clearly superior enemy and called on the German people to persevere, just as the people of Kolberg had done in 1807. Though largely forgotten today, the film's production and messaging remain deeply fascinating. What was the idea behind it? Why did so many resources flow into making it? Who was responsible for creating it in the first place? Did the film serve its propagandistic purposes? And what can it teach us about National Socialist propaganda in general? These questions and many more are going to be answered during this video. But first, let's turn back time to the year 1933. Shortly after the National Socialists took over power in Germany, they set about a process of attempting to rally the entire German people behind their cause. The 37% of people who voted for the NSDAP during the last free Reichstag election in July 1932 simply weren't enough. Instead, the entire German people was to support the Nazi ideology. To achieve this, the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, or RMVP, was established in March 1933 under the leadership of Joseph Goebbels, with the expressed goal of mentally mobilizing the Germans. The RMVP endeavored to portray the regime and its policies in a positive light. It also aimed to create the impression that the entire German people supported everything the regime did. This is actually one of the aspects that always set the Nazi dictatorship apart from all the others. The constant desire to get legitimization and support from the population for everything it did. And one of the most effective ways to spread propaganda was through the medium of the film. The 1930s are considered to be a golden age for the cinema, and in Germany the number of cinema-goers rose from 4 million in 1933 to almost 8 million just 5 years later. At the same time, the state and Goebbels gained almost complete control over the German film industry. In July 1933, the Reich Chamber of Film was established, whose leader was directly subordinated to Goebbels. From now on, the RMVP was able to decide on the dismissal and employment of all workers in film production. In February 1934, a new law was passed which required all movie scripts to be checked by the RMVP before shooting began. 1 year later, Goebbels personally also gained the right to ban any movie he wanted. Following severe financial difficulties, the two largest German film societies, UFA and Torbis, were practically nationalized. Today there exists this common image that people in Nazi Germany were subjected to a constant bombardment of propaganda, which led them to unconditionally support the National Socialist ideology and to worship Hitler like a god. But this was never the case. By the time the war broke out, Goebbels knew that his initial goal of completely mobilizing the German people had failed. Instead, the overly politicized media and the frequent speeches and public events had led to a widespread apathy towards the propaganda. After 1939, Goebbels' goal became much simpler: to encourage the Germans to keep fighting the war and to make sure that they fulfilled the demands of the regime. In the first years of the war, a series of major feature films were therefore released to defame opponents of the Nazi regime. In 1942, an anti-Soviet film called GPU was released, the title being the outdated name of the Soviet secret police. Despite the fact that Goebbels tried to appeal to the viewers by centering the narrative around a romantic love story, the film was a flop. Many viewers deemed the portrayal of the Russians as sadistic torturers who were all part of a Jewish conspiracy as stereotypical and not believable. No more anti-Soviet movies were produced afterwards. Until 1941, a number of anti-British movies were released as well. My Life for Ireland was about an Irish family during the Irish War for Independence. The Fox of Glenavon tells the story of an Irish wife of a British magistrate who falls in love with an Irish nationalist. Culbert was a biopic about the colonial administrator of the same name, and Krüger was a film about the Boer Wars. In all these films, the British are depicted as decadent plutocrats who brutally oppress the occupied peoples in their colonial empire. For example, Krüger goes to great lengths to show the suffering of Boer women in British concentration camps, which admittedly was one of the most reprehensible chapters of Britain's history, but is still hypocritical, coming from the Nazis of all people. Winston Churchill is also in the movie, and he is depicted as the drunk and gluttonous commander of the camp. While the prisoners are starving, we see him having a hearty breakfast and even feeding some ham to his bulldog. Later in the film, Churchill just shoots a woman with a pistol who loudly protests against the terrible quality of the food they were given. All of this is of course fantasy. The real Churchill never commanded a concentration camp. Instead, he even showed great sympathy for the suffering of the Boers and called for them to be treated better. But due to the fact that Churchill was the leader of the only country Germany was at war with at the time, and that he made it very clear that Britain was going to fight until the end, the filmmakers made him out to be this cruel and bloodthirsty monster. With the exception of Krüger, which was praised for its acting, all these films were only of mixed success. The reason for that is simple: the Germans were simply becoming tired of seeing the same propagandistic tropes every day. They wanted a distraction from everyday life during a war, and to forget about their daily worries. This becomes evident in the fact that the two most successful movies during the war years, Wunschkonzert and Die große Liebe, were both love stories about couples who got separated by the war and then reunited in the end. Faced with their success, Goebbels instructed that 4 out of 5 produced movies should be good, high-quality entertainment films. Out of 74 films which were released in 1943, 41 were comedies. Still, while these movies may have been unpolitical on the surface, they nonetheless also served as another instrument to keep the German people in line, by enforcing cultural hegemony, by pleasing an audience so that they would be more susceptible to political films, and by providing short-term entertainment. Goebbels understood that a strategic mixture of entertainment and indoctrination was far more effective than just pure propaganda alone. A quintessential escapist comedy film is Die Feuerzangenbowle from 1944, starring Heinz Rühmann, one of the most popular German actors at the time. It tells the story of a famous homeschooled writer who goes undercover as a student at a grammar school in order to make up for the school life he had missed. The film mostly consists of scenes showing him pranking his clueless teachers and causing chaos at the school. Today, the piece has acquired a sort of cult status in Germany, and it is often shown on TV during Christmas time. At the University of Göttingen, the Feuerzangenbowle is played every year in a lecture hall, and it has become a mass ritual attended by thousands of students who come to watch the movie, drink mulled wine, and have a good time. After the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad, a new period of National Socialist propaganda came about, which focused on the indoctrination of fear and the call to keep fighting. The war wouldn't end so soon, and it would bring extreme hardship for the German people. Nobody recognized this better than Joseph Goebbels, who knew that the entire home front would need to be mobilized and prepared for the fight. In his infamous Total War speech in February 1943, Goebbels prepared the Germans for what was to come, and he accompanied it with the spreading of fear of the brutal, subhuman Bolshevik who intended to destroy Western civilization for good and who needed to be stopped at all costs. These messages would also have to be conveyed in the cinema. Of course, escapist and light romance/comedy movies were still made en masse, but Goebbels also needed some films that called on the population to endure against overwhelming odds and to believe in the final victory. To do this, Goebbels liked to turn to history for reassurance, particularly to the story of King Frederick the Great of Prussia. The 1942 film The Great King told the story of how Frederick refused to capitulate after the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Kunersdorf during the 7 Years' War, despite the pleas of his advisors. In the end, his will to keep on fighting paid off, and Prussia won the war. Even though the film was released in spring 1942, when the war still seemed winnable, it already prepared the audience for a longer battle, and challenged them to persevere. Frederick came to embody the ultimate example of an unyielding spirit that refused to accept defeat, a role model for all Germans. Now, in 1943, Goebbels needed a new film that could urge the Germans to stand firm and wait for the war to turn to Germany's favour once again. He informed his staff, "It ought to be the mission of all German propaganda to create a myth from the heroism of Stalingrad, a myth which can become a precious ornament in German history." 5 months later, he commissioned Veit Harlan to direct such a film. "I hereby commission you to produce the epic film Kolberg. The film is to demonstrate, through the example of the town that gives it its title, that a people united at home and at the front will overcome any foe. I authorize you to request whatever assistance you feel necessary from all government, party and military agencies." Harlan was the man for the job. He was one of the most famous directors of his time, and can be considered one of the main beneficiaries of National Socialism. After 1940, he mainly focused on political propaganda films, among them the aforementioned The Great King, and the infamous anti-Semitic historical drama Jud Süß. The movie Kolberg was supposed to tell the story of the siege of the small town of Kolberg, better known today under its Polish name Kołobrzeg, by Napoleonic troops in 1807. The year prior, Napoleon had attacked Prussia, decisively defeated the Prussians at Jena and Auerstedt, and then occupied Berlin. During this war, Kolberg successfully managed to hold off the French troops until the war ended. The old commander of the Kolberg garrison had been replaced by a new, energetic major, August Neidhart von Gneisenau, who would later modernize the Prussian army and play an important role in the Battle of Waterloo. He was supported by the chairman of the town council, Joachim Nettelbeck, and together the two of them organized the defense of the city. For multiple months, the Prussian garrison, alongside local civilians, defended Kolberg against a French force that eventually numbered 13,000 men. Large parts of the town were destroyed, and hundreds of people died, but Kolberg remained in Prussian hands. For the French, this was just a small irritation, as Napoleon had humiliated the Prussians anyway, and Kolberg did little to change the course of the war. For the Prussians, however, Kolberg became a symbol of popular resistance against a superior foe, despite all the odds. You can probably see how Goebbels wanted to use this event to draw a parallel to the retreat of the German army in World War II and the Allied bombing of German cities. On the 22nd of May, he wrote in his diary, "I am hoping for extraordinarily much from this Harlan film. It fits in perfectly with the political and military mood we will probably have to contend with when the film appears." The film became a huge priority, and Goebbels set everything in motion to make it the grandest movie of all time. Thousands of active soldiers were released from their duties to play on the film's sets. The actual crown and scepter of the Holy Roman Emperor were borrowed to make the few scenes with Francis II more authentic. Several thousand meters of colour film were produced out of nitrocellulose, a rationed ingredient which was used in weapon production. Because the movie was scheduled to be released around Christmas 1943, Harlan immediately got to work writing a script. In an effort to appeal to the audience, Harlan wanted to turn the story into a historical melodrama by putting a young, beautiful woman called Maria at the focus of the story. The role was to be played by none other than his Swedish wife, Kristina Söderbaum. Goebbels was not a fan at all of the first draft. He wrote, "It will take a great deal of effort to make Harlan give up the idea. Nevertheless, it must be done since I put such great hope for our inner peace of mind in this Kolberg film, in which so much money is invested. We must therefore have a film ready to encourage and support the toughness of civilian resistance. In such matters, women have less of a say than men." The film should also be much more nationalistic and more prominently feature Nettelbeck, and so Harlan got to work again, and in July his second draft was ready. This one was much more to Goebbels' liking, but it still focused too much on the disaster scenes and less on intimate moments. After a few more rounds of revision and rewriting, shooting finally began in October 1943. Due to logistical problems, material shortages, and Goebbels' constant interferences, it took much longer than initially expected, and was only finished in summer of 1944. Editing took about another 3 months, and when it was finished in November, the chance of this film still making an impression on the German public was starting to dwindle drastically, as the military situation was getting more dire by the day. Goebbels described it to Hitler as a first-rate political masterpiece, and as an answer to all the questions currently preoccupying the German people. Of course, he still wasn't completely happy with it, and he initiated another round of discussion on how to improve the movie. In December 1944, he ordered Harlan to re-edit the film, and, surprise, he was still not satisfied with the new result. This was his magnum opus after all, and considering the amount of money and resources that had flown into Kolberg, the movie better be damn perfect. In the end, Goebbels ordered UFA head producer Wolfgang Liebenheiner to produce the final cut, and it was finally ready in January 1945. In order to make more of an impact, the film premiered on the 30th of January for its symbolic meaning. But, as we've seen at the start of this video, it was unlikely that it would still make an impact within this unfolding disaster. Still, let us finally take a look and analyse the most expensive movie the Nazis ever made. Funnily enough, the film already starts off with a lie. The title screen claims that production had begun in 1942, when we know that it had in fact begun in summer 1943. It seems like the propaganda ministry wanted it to appear that Kolberg was not an answer to the military defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa. So while the movie was definitely a call for total war, it still strangely denies the circumstances that made such a total war necessary in the first place. The movie starts out in Breslau in 1813, the year in which the German Wars of Liberation began after Napoleon's catastrophic Russian campaign. We see a crowd of people consisting of both civilians and Prussian soldiers marching through the streets and singing a patriotic anthem that ends with the phrases "Das Volk steht auf, der Sturm bricht los," or "The people rise up, the storm breaks loose" in English. This was a line from a poem by Theodor Körner, a patriotic poet in the early 19th century. Goebbels liked this phrase a lot, and he used it in his Total War speech in 1943 to draw a parallel between the Wars of Liberation and the current war against the Allies. We then see Major Gneisenau barge into King Frederick William III's room in order to convince him to turn to his people and to proclaim the liberation of Germany. Frederick William is reluctant, and he insists that war is only the matter of the military and not the civilians. Gneisenau answers by pointing to the example of Kolberg, which only managed to resist the French troops with the help of the common people, and that a new time has come in which the people will rise up and liberate Prussia.
Die Bürger waren es, die allein nicht kapitulierten. Sie gaben uns Militärs erst die Möglichkeit, die Festung zu halten. Damals in Kolberg erlebte ich die Geburtsstunde der deutschen Freiheit, als Fürsten und Könige ihr Volk verlassen hatten.
In the movie, Gneisenau is portrayed as this young man, when in reality he was 53 years old at this point, 10 years older than the king himself. This was not a mistake though, it was intentional. By contrasting the timid and stiff king with the energetic Gneisenau, Harlan wanted to claim that in times of hardship, old ideas and assumptions would have to make room for new, revolutionary methods. The people, against all voices of reason, would have to fight for the Third Reich too. The movie then takes us to Vienna in 1806, and we see Francis II abdicating from his role as Holy Roman Emperor in the hopes that it might bring peace. The plot then switches to Kolberg, and we see the entire town dancing and celebrating during a local festival. But Joachim Nettelbeck, played by Heinrich George, is not in the mood for celebrating. He reads a proclamation to the German people by Napoleon Bonaparte, and knows that it's just a matter of time before Kolberg will be affected by the war too. While the others around the table have no issue with capitulating, Nettelbeck insists that the town should resist, whatever it takes. Nettelbeck then gets up and makes his way to Farmer Werner and his daughter Maria, played by Christina Söderbaum. He informs them that the Prussians were defeated at Jena and Auerstedt. He's upset with the city commander Lucadou, played by Paul Wegener, who decided not to inform the populace so as to not disturb the festivities. Another change of scenery, this time to Potsdam, and we see Emperor of the French Napoleon I in all of his glory. He stands over the coffin of Frederick II and shows his admiration for him. Back in Kolberg, Maria's brother returns from Auerstedt alongside Lieutenant Ferdinand von Schill, played by Gustav Diesel, and they ask for quarters. We then see Nettelbeck in Commander Lucadou's office, and the two of them are arguing. Nettelbeck is worried about the supply situation in the town and confronts the commander about the fact that Kolberg is not going to be able to hold out for long in case of a siege. Lucadou is appalled that a simple, low-born burgher wants to give him military advice and just throws him out. Lieutenant Schill inspects the local fortifications and also realizes that the defenses are absolutely useless in their current state. Maria, who seems to be taking a liking to Schill, sees this as well.
Alle reden doch schon von den schlechten Kanonen und von der schlechten Proviantierung. Die Festung, so wie sie jetzt ist einem Angriff nicht gewachsen. So? Sagt Nettelbeck.
God forbid a woman be allowed to have her own thoughts. Maria obviously yearns for the sexy mustache man, so she follows him to the beach and the two of them walk together until they decide to lie down. Maria confesses that she's scared of the war and says that war is pointless in general. Schill comforts her and they kiss. On the next day, Schill begins to recruit volunteers from the city and trains them to fight, something which Lucadou is visibly upset about. Schill defends his decision and argues that the common people are essential for winning the war. They love their city and their home, so they will be more than willing to fight for the cause. He knows that the war will reach Kolberg, and that it's going to be the citizens who will have to defend their town.
Herr Oberst, in den Bürgern liegt die Rettung des Vaterlandes. Auf ihren Mut und auf ihre Haltung kommt es an. Wenn eine Festung belagert wird, dann gibt es keinen Unterschied mehr zwischen Bürger und Soldaten.
Once again, the movie is directly speaking to the German viewer in a way that couldn't be clearer. Winter has arrived and a heated discussion breaks out in the town hall. The General Governor of Pomerania orders all cities to surrender without resistance and to swear an oath to Napoleon. Several people in the council see no problem in surrendering and argue that it's better to escape unscathed from the war than to fight just for the sake of it. Nettelbeck is outraged by this. He says the cities were fighting for and calls out the others for their cowardice. When the French emissary walks in, Nettelbeck scoffs at him and tells him that the people of Kolberg would rather die than give up their loyalty to the King of Prussia.
Aber die freien Bürger der alten Hansestadt Kolberg wollen sich lieber unter den Trümmern ihrer Mauern begraben lassen, als ihren Eid auf den König und Herrn brechen. Wir haben auf den König von Preußen geschworen.
In response, Napoleon orders that the Kolbergers be demoralized and the town be destroyed with cannons. This is, of course, a direct analogy to the Allied bombing campaign against German cities. It is now the year 1807 and the French army marches on Kolberg. Nettelbeck and Schill prepare for the inevitable by ordering a number of cannons from Sweden, much to the dismay of Lucadou, who sees this as an act of insubordination. He also makes no secret of the fact that he is considering capitulation as soon as the situation becomes precarious. An enraged Nettelbeck draws his sword and charges towards the commander, which leads to his arrest. Once again, the theme of the young and energetic needing to assert themselves against the old and stubborn in times of great need takes center stage, just like in the scene with Gneisenau and the king. The assault finally begins, and the French have immediately taken over the farm of Maria and her family, where they proceed to get drunk and trash the place. The Prussian cavalry arrives and they drive out the French, but Schill realizes that the farm provides too much of an advantage for the enemy for it to be left standing. He asks Maria and the farmer to do the unthinkable and to sacrifice their home for the defense of Kolberg. Maria protests energetically.
Schill, ist das dein Ernst?
Meines es schon. Aber ich weiß nicht, ob euer Ernst so weit geht, dass ihr euren Hof für Kolberg opfert.
In the end, however, she knows that it needs to be done, and the house is set on fire. She has put the well-being of the entire people before her own, which was another common tenet of Nazi ideology. In the next scene, the people of Kolberg demand that Nettelbeck be set free and that he be pardoned. Lucadou initially refuses, but Schill makes it clear that the French are only a few miles away and that the people need someone to lead them. In prison, Nettelbeck hands Maria a letter and asks her to break through the enemy lines and to deliver it to the Prussian king in Königsberg himself. The letter asks for a new commander who is young and brave, unlike Lucadou. At first, Schill is unwilling to let the love of his life embark on this journey, but Maria convinces him, reminding him of her duty and her bravery.
Du kleines Mädchen sollst das tun?
Warum nicht? Hast du von mir verlangt, dass wir unser Haus verbrennen? Da hast du nicht dran gedacht, dass ich ein kleines Mädchen bin. Du hast mehr von uns verlangt als Nettelbeck jetzt.
So Maria heads to Königsberg, and after a little persuasion, she lands an audience with Queen Louisa herself. After the two of them stare at each other for a bit, Louisa shows great sympathy for the people of Kolberg and promises to hand the letter over to the king. Back in Kolberg, the siege is in full swing, and finally a new commander has arrived, the Shining Gneisenau. Initially, he and the freshly released Nettelbeck don't get along very well, but they come to the conclusion that they need each other if they want to endure the siege. Gneisenau gives a rousing patriotic speech in the market square, and then he decides to attack the French positions. What follows are a number of battle scenes, and while they are impressive from a technical standpoint and entertaining to watch, there's not much to say about them. What's interesting, however, is that the movie was initially supposed to feature a lot more scenes showing the destruction of the town and the suffering of the local population, but those were mostly cut out by Goebbels. According to the propaganda minister, these scenes would only lead to further resignation and not to a rekindled determination to win. According to the director, these new cuts alone cost around 2 million Reichsmark. Just how many of these scenes were cut out exactly is impossible to determine, but one may ask how effective this film was at making propaganda for the so-called Endsieg if it refuses to at least touch on the everyday consequences of the war already experienced by the German population. It's just bizarre. The film clearly wanted to be blunt propaganda, while at the same time being escapist and light-hearted, and it just doesn't work. The battle goes well for the Prussians at first, but the French send so many reinforcements that further resistance seems futile. Gneisenau considers capitulation. Nettelbeck drops to his knees and begs him to keep on fighting. Envisioned by Goebbels as the ideal role model for all German civilians, he would rather die than surrender.
Kolberg darf nicht aufgegeben werden. Nein.
So wollte ich's von Ihnen hören, Nettelbeck. Jetzt können wir zusammen sterben.
The French begin one final attack, but their losses are too high and so they retreat. Kolberg, while heavily destroyed, has been saved. Everyone gathers in the city centre to celebrate and to sing. Everyone except for Maria, who goes to the beach and sheds a tear. Maria has arguably the biggest character arc in the story. Initially she was afraid of the war and saw it as senseless, but when the actual fighting broke out, she gave everything away for Kolberg. Her house had been burnt down, her family was dead, and even Schill was gone. Maria is not only the most tragic character in the movie, she also served as a role model for all German women. Blonde with blue eyes, humble and an upholder of simple peasant customs, she is portrayed as the archetypical Aryan woman. Her bravery and sacrifice were crucial in winning this siege. She gave up everything just for Kolberg. Goebbels wrote in his diary, "I am very happy that she is absolutely uncompromising and radical on the question of total war. If all Nazi women thought as she does, total war would be much more of a reality." Nettelbeck arrives at the beach and comforts her.
Du hast alles hergegeben, Maria, was du hattest. Aber es war nicht umsonst. Bist ja auch auf deinem Platz geblieben. Hast deine Pflicht getan und dich nicht gefürchtet vom Sterben. Du hast auch mitgesiegt, Maria.
This was the end of the flashback, and we once again see Gneisenau in Breslau. The king is finally convinced, and he writes a proclamation for his people. The crowd stands outside his residence and they sing, "Das Volk steht auf." The movie ends with the determined face of Gneisenau staring at the future. So, what should we think about Kolberg? The movie is undoubtedly well produced, the acting is great and the plot is definitely interesting. But one thing is certain, all the resources and all the time spent on it were not worth it. Because of its late release, only a small handful of people actually saw the movie. And it's more than doubtful that those who did actually believed in its message. At the beginning of 1945, no sane person actually still believed in a German victory, and if anything, this film might have just been perceived as an insult to injury. Maybe it was actually for the better that Kolberg was such a gigantic flop, because its propaganda effect was useless anyway. If anything, the movie served no purpose than to secure Goebbels' legacy. He too knew that the war was lost, and he had been contemplating suicide for a very long time. And so he simply worked on stylizing himself and Nazi Germany for the world that comes after him. Looking at it from this perspective, Kolberg is not really a total war film designed for the German people, but rather a propagandistic history movie made by Goebbels to glorify the total defeat of the Third Reich in World War II. For the people living in the actual town of Kolberg, this movie was of no use. When the city was surrounded by Soviet and Polish troops in March 1945, the commander requested that he be allowed to surrender without a fight. Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The Führer immediately removed him and put a younger officer in his place. Have these degenerate generals no sense of history or of responsibility? Does a present-day military commander of Kolberg nurture the ambition to emulate a Lükadu rather than a Gneisenau?" After 2 weeks of senseless fighting, the city surrendered. It had been completely destroyed and countless people, among them Polish forced labourers, had died. On the day of the surrender, Goebbels wrote, "We have now had to evacuate Kolberg. The town, which has been defended with such extraordinary heroism, could no longer be held. I will ensure that the evacuation of Kolberg is not mentioned in the OKW report. In view of the severe psychological repercussions on the Kolberg film, we could do without that for the moment." So, essentially, the civilians of Kolberg died for no other reason than to defend the integrity of the Kolberg movie, and so that propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels could try to make a point. Definitely not a cause worth dying for. Dankeschön for watching until the end. As you probably know, making these videos is extremely time consuming, so if you want to make sure that I make more of them, please consider supporting me on Patreon. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon exclusive Discord server, and depending on your tier, a number of other sweet benefits. In any case, thank you to my invaluable supporters: Marius Gerling, Ian York, Leader Titan, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Philipp Marchewka, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drole, Wienweh, Pseudoriser, Lowell Furphy, Yin, William, Big Dave, Folling, and Turdham Bone. Have a very nice day, and see you next time.